Welcome to City Vision University's podcast, providing book summaries of books on rescue missions, city missions, and the Salvation Army. Welcome to this deep dive.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I want you to imagine losing absolutely everything. I mean, your job, your savings, your family connections, and ultimately your home.
Yeah, just complete devastation.
Exactly. You're exhausted. You're carrying whatever is left of your life and, a few trash bags. And you finally walk through the doors of a homeless shelter.
Right.
And you brace yourself for the inevitable.
Right.
The sterile metal cots, the harsh fluorescent lighting, maybe that smell of institutional
Bleach. The drain in the center of a concrete floor.
Yes, exactly. But instead, you stop in your tracks, you look around the sunlit courtyard, and you whisper to yourself, this place is actually a lot nicer than my last apartment.
It is, it's a really profound and startling paradox, honestly.
It really is.
Because we've been conditioned, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a society, we associate the fear and the trauma of losing a home with environments that are just strictly utilitarian.
Right, bare bones survival.
Exactly. We expect minimal survival spaces.
Mm-hmm.
So to associate that absolute moment of crisis with an environment that evokes awe or comfort or breathtaking beauty, it feels completely counterintuitive.
It totally flips the cultural script on its head. And that's what we're looking at today. We are exploring the story, the philosophy, and the honestly deeply hard-fought history of the Orange County Rescue Mission.
Often called OCRM.
Right, OCRM, and specifically their flagship facility, the Village of Hope. We're drawing all this from an incredible historical account in the book Village of Hope by Lela Gilbert.
And our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack what amounts to a radical, almost, subversive approach to solving the crisis of homelessness.
Yeah, subversive is a good word for it.
Because we aren't just looking at the logistics of, how to provide a hot meal and a blanket. We are investigating this really challenging idea that beauty and fine art and aesthetics aren't just frivolous luxuries for the wealthy.
Right.
They are actually fundamental, non-negotiable tools for rescuing human dignity.
That concept immediately makes me think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Oh, yeah, the classic pyramid.
Right. Everyone knows it from Psych 101. At the very bottom, that massive foundation, you have physiological needs. Food, water, warmth, basic shelter.
Right, survival.
Yeah. And then moving up, you get safety, then love and belonging, esteem. Mm-hmm. And way, way up at that tiny little point at the top, you have self-actualization, which includes the appreciation of aesthetics and beauty.
Exactly.
But the standard societal view of helping destitute people is that you only really have the budget and the time to build that bottom block.
You provide the concrete room and the daily calories, and that's it.
Exactly. But looking at the Village of Hope, they're effectively demanding that we flip that pyramid upside down.
Yeah.
They're offering top-tier aesthetic beauty right alongside those basic biological survival needs.
They're essentially arguing that when you're dealing with profound human trauma and, chronic homelessness is almost always a symptom of deep compounding trauma.
Oh, absolutely.
You simply cannot separate the bottom of the pyramid from the top. If you only feed a person's stomach, but you entirely ignore their soul, their intellect, their need for worth, you aren't actually rescuing the person.
You're just managing them.
Right. You're merely sustaining their current state of despair. You're keeping them alive in their misery rather than actually pulling them out of it.
Wow. So let's paint a vivid picture for the listener of what this radical premise actually looks like on the ground. Because when we say the Village of Hope is beautiful, we aren't talking about slapping a fresh coat of beige paint on some drywall and putting a plastic fern in the lobby.
No, definitely not.
We are talking about a stunning 150,000 square foot development set across 5 meticulously manicured acres.
It is massive. It's a campus located on a decommissioned military base in Southern California, which carries a staggering amount of historical irony that we will definitely explore later.
Oh, we definitely will.
But purely from a physical standpoint, the facility is a masterclass in intentional, dignified design.
Take the entrance, for example. Visitors and residents don't walk through, like, a chain link fence or an industrial door. They enter through these massive, custom-sculpted metal gates designed by a world-renowned artist named Albert Paley.
Yeah, the metalwork is imposing, but it's intricate and welcoming at the same time.
Right. And you walk through those gates and you step into this sprawling centerpiece called the William Kerlick Betty Barnes Johnson Courtyard.
It's breathtaking.
And right there in the middle of this courtyard sits a monumental urn created by the acclaimed artist Peter Brandes.
Yeah, and Brandes is a really crucial figure in the aesthetic of the campus because he also designed the stunning stained glass windows in the Village of Hope Chapel.
Wait, actual stained glass?
Yes, and these aren't just, generic decorative windows you'd buy out of the catalog. They are highly evocative custom pieces depicting scenes like the crucifixion of Jesus and figures like St. Thaddeus.
St. Thaddeus. Okay, wait, St. Thaddeus is the patron saint of lost causes, right?
He is.
Think about the psychological weight of that. You have a person who society has just completely written off as a lost cause, stepping into a space where the very light filtering into the room is refracted through a multi-million-dollar piece of fine art dedicated to the concept that no one is truly beyond hope.
It's powerful.
I mean, we're talking about museum-quality fine art seamlessly integrated into a transitional living facility.
Which brings us to the core philosophy driven by OCRM's president, Jim Palmer, and key philanthropists who shaped the mission, like Howard and Roberta Amundsen.
Right.
They insist on this level of artistic excellence, not as an afterthought or like a nice bonus if there's leftover money. They view beauty as a primary catalyst for behavioral and spiritual change.
That's a big shift in thinking.
It is. The theological and psychological underpinnings here are immense. The book quotes Roberta Amundsen articulating a really foundational belief, which is, we become what we worship.
Let's linger on that for a second. We become what we worship. So if you look at what has our attention, what dominates our visual and mental landscape, that's the mold we're pouring ourselves into.
Precisely. If our vision is constantly filled with the good, the orderly, the intentional, the beautiful, that is what we subconsciously work toward becoming.
Right.
Conversely, consider what society is implicitly telling a homeless family when we place them in a dilapidated concrete bunker with peeling paint and metal detectors.
Yeah, we're telling them that their inherent worth is equal to a concrete bunker.
Exactly. They internalize that degradation. The physical environment becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of low expectations.
There's actually a really piercing insight on this from Marvin Olasky, the author of The Tragedy of American Compassion. He points out that standard shelters, by only providing the bare biological necessities of, calories and a dry floor, effectively treat people like human pets.
Human pets. It's a brutal phrasing.
It really is.
But it captures a tragic historical shift in social work. Olasky observes that many modern shelters will gladly provide a cafeteria, maybe medical facilities, daycare. But the Village of Hope goes further by integrating a chapel and fine art because they operate on the belief that homeless men and women possess eternal value.
They're human beings.
Right. They are human beings created with dignity, not just civic liabilities to be managed and warehoused. Beauty serves as a constant, nonverbal reminder that, as Olasky notes, our stomach is not our God. We are complex, fearfully and beautifully made creatures.
Okay, I have to step in here and play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
Because I know exactly the friction this creates for the pragmatists listening right now. Let's just look at the math.
Okay.
Commissioning massive sculpted gates by Albert Paley and fine art stained glass by Peter Brandes costs hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. If you're running a nonprofit and you have a finite pool of donor money, isn't that undeniably frivolous?
It's the first question everyone asks.
Right, because how on earth do you justify commissioning fine art when that exact same money could literally buy hundreds more beds or fund thousands of hot meals if people are freezing on the street outside? How do you defend stained glass inside?
It is the most natural, necessary question to ask. The utilitarian math always pushes us toward the highest volume of basic survival units.
Right, get as many people indoors as possible.
Exactly. But the philosophy at OCRM counters this strict utilitarianism by introducing the biblical concept of pure religion.
Okay.
They specifically look to the book of James, chapter 1, verse 27, which speaks of looking after orphans and widows in their distress. Jim Palmer frames the pursuit of beauty as an essential, inseparable component of this pure religion.
So it's not a distraction from the mission, it is the mission.
Yes. Palmer asks a rhetorical question. What is more beautiful than rescuing someone from the dark? He argues that beauty is necessary because it radically intensifies the contrast between the darkness of the streets and the light of recovery.
So it's about engineering a psychological shock to the system.
Yes. Put yourself in the shoes of a homeless mother with her children. Let's say they've been living out of a sedan for 6 months.
Okay.
They're navigating dark, cold, dangerous streets. They are constantly sleep-deprived, constantly on guard.
Hypervigilant all the time.
Exactly. They feel entirely invisible, discarded by society, totally devoid of any worth. When they are brought into a place like the Village of Hope, a place that is clearly expensive, highly intentional, impeccably clean, and breathtakingly beautiful, they are instantly infused with a level of dignity they may not have felt in years, or perhaps ever.
Wow.
That physical environment acts as a spark.
It communicates a very specific message without anyone having to say a word. It says, you are worth this level of investment.
Exactly. And this isn't just, an abstract theory Palmer dreamed up in his office. This philosophy was formally articulated and debated during a major 2005 consultation in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Oh.
Yeah. The Amundsen's, alongside Jonathan Bradford of the Intercity Christian Federation, gathered leading architects, theologians, and urban community workers to discuss this exact tension between utilitarianism and aesthetics.
Okay, so they really stress-tested this idea.
They did. And after intense deliberation, they concluded that when working with the poor, there are 3 non-negotiable principles that must be present simultaneously.
Which are?
Respect, beauty, and opportunity.
Respect, beauty, opportunity. So if you remove any one of those legs, the stool just collapses.
Right. Without beauty, respect rings incredibly hollow. You can't tell someone you respect them while handing them a black trash bag for their belongings and pointing to a thin mat on a dirty floor.
Yeah, the actions don't match the words.
Exactly. And without beauty and respect, opportunity just feels like a bureaucratic chore, like a mandate to get a job, rather than a genuine invitation to restore one's life.
So treating a destitute family to a beautiful environment isn't some temporary, luxurious pit stop. It is the necessary active ingredient required to trigger actual long-term cognitive and behavioral transformation.
Exactly. It physically shifts their identity from hopeless victim to valued human being capable of recovery.
That makes a lot of sense. But to fully grasp how this organization reached a point where it could build million-dollar artistic campuses and, debate high-level aesthetic philosophy with leading architects, we have to travel back to its origins.
Oh, yeah.
Because the origins were, frankly, anything but beautiful. They started in the dirt under a bridge.
They really did.
Let's travel back to 1963. The historical backdrop here is vital for the listener to understand. It's a highly turbulent, anxious era in America. It's the year John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
Right.
The nation is gripped by Cold War paranoia, the terrifying reality of nuclear destruction. The Vietnam War is looming on the horizon, creating these massive societal fractures.
And locally, a new, quiet wave of drug addiction and displacement is just starting to ripple through communities.
Exactly. And in Orange County, California, which was a region rapidly becoming synonymous with idyllic suburban affluence, sunny prosperity, there was a deeply hidden crisis.
And the narrative introduces us to tech scrider Lewis Whitehead. He's a husky, imposing African-American career officer in the United States Marine Corps.
So he's driving through what was considered an undesirable part of Santa Ana, and he sees a physical disturbance, like a fight breaking out among a group of transient people under a bridge spanning the Santa Ana River.
Yeah.
Now, the natural human reaction here is deeply ingrained. Let's call it moral friction. We've all experienced it.
Oh, absolutely.
It's that societal inertia that trains us to look down at our shoes when we see suffering on the street. It's the voice in our head that says, keep driving. It's not safe. Let the police handle it. It's not my problem.
Yeah, somebody else will deal with it.
Right. And it takes a massive amount of personal, emotional energy to break the gravitational pull of that moral friction. Everyone else driving past that bridge in 1963 stayed in their cars.
But Whitehead breaks that social contract.
Yes, he does.
Acting on pure impulse and, frankly, military instinct. He pulls his car over, he gets out, walks down under the bridge, and uses his dominating, authoritative Marine presence to immediately quell the dispute. He breaks up the fight.
Wow.
But the truly historic moment isn't that he stopped the violence. It's what he did after the dust settled.
Right, because the standard response would be to dust off your hands, get back in the car, and feel really good about doing your civic duty for the day. But Whitehead stayed. He actually looked to the people living in the dirt.
The historical record points out a profound shift in his perspective in that exact moment. He didn't just see dirty, undesirable vagrants causing a public nuisance. As he began talking to them and returning to visit them over the following days and weeks, he realized he was looking at victims of deep, compounding emotional and spiritual wounds.
He saw the trauma.
He did. He recognized that their capacity to cope with the baseline responsibilities of society had been completely whittled away by unresolved traumas, often stretching way back to childhood. And they were relentlessly self-medicating with cheap alcohol to deaden the pain of that existence.
He saw the why behind the homelessness. He saw the root trauma, not just the ugly symptom of public intoxication.
Exactly.
And being a Marine, he doesn't just offer thoughts and prayers. He takes immediate logistical action. He starts holding a regular vigil with them under the bridge. He gathers extra clothing. And this is the detail that is just dripping with historical foreshadowing. He realizes they are starving, so he starts gathering scrap food and leftovers from his own military mess hall to feed these families.
And not just any mess hall, the mess hall located at the Tustin Marine Base.
The profound historical irony here is staggering. Tech Straight Lewis Whitehead fed his very first homeless families using leftovers carried out of the Tustin Marine Base mess hall in 1963. Decades later, the multi-million-dollar, architecturally stunning Village of Hope would be built on that exact same decommissioned military base, just a stone's throw from where that original mess hall stood.
It is a beautifully circular narrative. The geographical starting line became the ultimate finish line.
Yeah, it gives you goosebumps.
But to get from that dirt under the bridge to the Village of Hope took decades of grueling, exhausting struggle. Because once Whitehead's eyes were opened to the reality of the streets, he realized these invisible people were everywhere, hiding in the shadows of affluent Orange County.
And he was furious that his comfortable community was entirely ignoring them.
He was. He started standing up in his local church, speaking softly at first, trying to raise awareness, but eventually growing louder and much more confrontational. He chastised his affluent neighbors for failing to comfort these hurting people in their own backyard.
Wow, good for him.
Yeah, and through sheer force of will, he managed to rally a small handful of volunteers and built the bare-bones framework for the county's first rescue mission. They operated out of a cramped, rundown office located above a shoe store in downtown Santa Ana.
That grassroots effort officially birthed the Orange County Rescue Mission. But as the mission slowly grew to meet the overwhelming demand, it collided head-on with a city bureaucracy that was desperate to sanitize its public image.
Oh, yeah. The honeymoon phase ended pretty quickly.
Right. The mission wasn't just fighting poverty anymore. It was thrust into a bitter existential battle for the legal right to simply exist within city limits.
Which brings us into the intense zoning wars of the late 1970s and 1980s.
Okay, let's get into that.
So the mission had moved from above the shoe store into an old, dilapidated building at the corner of 2nd and Sycamore Streets in Santa Ana. But downtown Santa Ana was undergoing an aggressive revitalization phase at the time.
Gentrification.
Yes. The city council looked at the rescue mission with its lines of transient men waiting for a meal and legally declared the property a blight. They condemned the building, utilizing eminent domain powers with the explicit intention of tearing it down to build a parking lot.
A parking lot, wow. It is the ultimate textbook manifestation of the NIMBY syndrome. Not in my backyard.
Exactly.
In urban planning, everyone conceptually agrees that helping the homeless is a noble, necessary cause. But they universally demand that the actual facility be located far away from their own homes, their own parks, and their own businesses.
The sheer frustration of the mission during this era is palpable in the archives. There is a brilliant 1980 editorial from the Los Angeles Times that perfectly encapsulates the bureaucratic absurdity OCRM was facing.
What did it say?
The editorial board noted that the mission scoured the entirety of Santa Ana looking for a new home. But every single time they identified a viable property, the local community erupted in protest, and the city council subsequently opposed the move. The Times wrote, "The city thus far has been telling the mission where it can't be. It would be nice if it started by telling the mission where it can relocate."
Yeah, that sums it up perfectly. This existential threat to the mission, the very real possibility that they would be zoned out of existence, attracted the attention of a highly influential figure, Howard Amundsen. Amundsen was a man of immense inherited wealth who was undergoing a deep personal and theological wrestling match regarding the biblical stewardship of money. Amundsen had already been visiting the mission with a singles group from Mariners Church. He would go down there, play the piano for the residents, and speak to the men about financial responsibility.
Which, if we are being completely honest, sounds incredibly tone-deaf on the surface.
Right. You have a wealthy heir to a financial fortune standing in a crumbling building, lecturing destitute, homeless men about financial responsibility.
It does sound deeply incongruous to our modern sensibilities. But Amundsen's theological perspective was rooted in the idea of inherent human dignity and agency.
Okay.
He believed that Christian philanthropy isn't an exclusive club for the rich. He believed everyone is called to give based on their capacity. He drew directly on the biblical story of the widow's mite, where the poorest woman gives a fraction of a penny, but it is valued more than the gold of the rich.
Oh, I see.
Amundsen was teaching these men that even as they were at rock bottom receiving help, their ultimate recovery would eventually require them to become contributors to society again. It was about refusing to view them perpetually as helpless victims.
Right. It's about restoring agency.
Exactly. But more importantly, for the immediate survival of the organization, Amundsen didn't just write a check for new cots. He deployed his resources to fund a high-powered legal team to fight the city of Santa Ana, specifically on the grounds of property rights.
And his philosophical framing of this legal battle is fascinating. We're so used to viewing politics through a strict, polarized binary right versus left.
Right.
But Amundsen saw the plight of the rescue mission as a rare, perfect intersection of two historically divergent ideologies. And to be clear to the listener, we are just imparting his perspective from the source text here.
Right, exactly. So Amundsen noted that this zoning battle successfully united the political left's traditional systemic concern for social justice and the marginalized poor with the political right's traditional systemic concern for private property rights against an overreaching, all-powerful government state.
That's a fascinating overlap.
He argued vehemently that the property rights of a group of citizens shouldn't be unilaterally denied by a city council simply because those citizens were utilizing their property to do what they believed God called them to do, serving the poor.
But Amundsen hits on a very depressing structural issue in urban development here. He points out that by the government's own zoning and aesthetic standards, almost any institution that serves the severely afflicted, the mentally ill, or the deeply impoverished is naturally going to be classified as a blight.
Yes.
If your mission is to serve broken people, the state looks at the foot traffic and the aesthetic of your clientele and officially views your property as broken.
Amundsen asked the logical, sarcastic question. What should the rescue mission do? Turn into a high-end bed and breakfast and try to attract affluent clients? The very nature of their restorative work made them an automatic target for zoning eviction.
Okay, but again, I need to push back here on behalf of the city planners and the local residents.
But here.
If you are a homeowner who has invested your entire life savings into a house and you're raising your kids in that neighborhood, don't you have a legitimate fundamental right to protect your neighborhood? We have to acknowledge reality. Transient populations, especially those dealing with untreated severe mental illness or active drug addiction, can bring associated issues.
Absolutely.
Property crime can go up, public safety can feel compromised. How does a city council practically balance the moral imperative of compassion for the poor with the absolute civic duty to maintain order, safety, and property values for its taxpayers?
It is the defining, agonizing tension of urban planning in every major city in the world.
Yeah.
The mission's business manager at the time, Rob Martin, actually confronted this head on.
Oh, he did?
Yeah. He sat down for a face-to-face meeting with the leader of the local neighborhood associations who were fighting the mission tooth and nail. Martin physically spread a giant map of the city of Santa Ana on the table between them, slid it across, and challenged the neighborhood leader, saying, "Show me one place on this map where you won't fight me. Just point to a location where we are allowed to exist."
Wow. And what did they say?
The response he got was chillingly revealing about how local politics operates. The neighborhood leader looked at the map and replied bluntly, "No. If we lose, we win."
If we lose, we win. Wow. Let's unpack the psychology of that statement. What does that mean in the context of a neighborhood dispute?
It reveals the dark, cynical side of political mobilization. The analysis drawn from the historical record is that organizing people politically, getting them to show up to city council meetings on a Tuesday night, getting them to donate to a neighborhood pack of tea, almost always requires a perpetual grievance.
Right. You need an enemy to keep the group united.
Exactly. The neighborhood association leadership didn't necessarily want to actually solve the complex problem of where the homeless mission should be permanently located. They wanted to harness the intense political energy that was generated by fighting the mission.
The fight itself was the goal.
Yes. The perpetual conflict itself is what gave the neighborhood association its power, relevance, and cohesion. If they solved the problem, they would lose their unifying grievance. Therefore, if they lose the fight, meaning the mission stays, they win the political momentum.
That is incredibly cynical. But, I mean, It rings entirely true to the mechanics of outrage politics. Ultimately, the mission, aided by their pro bono attorney, Tom Whaling, managed to secure a spot across from the county welfare office.
Right.
It was located in a rough area next to Birch Park. The LA Times noted at the time that this specific area was already a massive gathering place for transients, complete with widespread public intoxication and discarded mattresses littering the sidewalks. It wasn't a victory of finding a beautiful location. It was a gritty, desperate move just to keep the doors open.
Surviving the city's relentless attempts to shut them down kept the legal entity of the mission alive. But by the late 1980s, they were merely surviving, entirely on the defensive and far from thriving. The environment they were operating in was harsh and traumatizing in its own right.
Oh, that takes a toll.
It would take a total transition in leadership and a massive infusion of fresh volunteers to pivot the organization from bare-bones survival into dynamic, visionary expansion.
Which ushers us conceptually into a completely new paradigm for OCRM. But legal victories don't automatically generate human transformation. You can win the right to exist on paper, but if your bank account is completely empty and your physical program is limited to a handful of cots, you aren't a sanctuary, you're just a waiting room.
Very true.
That was the grim reality Jim Palmer faced when he took over the leadership of the mission. The starting picture Lela Gilbert paints is unimaginably bleak. Palmer steps into the executive director role, looks at the ledger, and realizes he has exactly 9 staff members, a grand total of 9 homeless beds in their actual recovery program, and $90,000 in crippling debt.
It was a seemingly insurmountable hole to climb out of. The organization was on life support. But Palmer understood immediately that to save the mission, he couldn't just rely on internal restructuring. He needed to aggressively engage the broader community, particularly the massive, vibrant faith communities emerging across Southern California at the time.
And this is where the unique cultural history of Orange County profoundly intersects with the survival of the mission. We see the heavy involvement of the Jesus movement. For those who might not be familiar with the cultural history of the 1970s and 80s, the Jesus movement was this massive, explosive, evangelical Christian revival that swept directly through the hippie counterculture. You had tens of thousands of young people, many of whom had lived transient lifestyles, surfed, done heavy psychedelics, and essentially dropped out of mainstream society, who suddenly experienced these profound, radical spiritual awakenings.
And because so many of these newly energized young believers had deeply personal, lived experience with homelessness, addiction, and living on the margins of society, they possess a unique, visceral empathy for the exact populations OCRM was trying to serve.
They understood it firsthand.
They didn't view the homeless from an ivory tower. They viewed them as peers. The historical account specifically highlights the involvement of John Wimber, a highly influential figure who led the rapidly growing Vineyard Christian Fellowship in Orange County, along with Keith Green, who was arguably the most famous Christian musician and activist of that era.
The Vineyard Church stepped up in a massive way. They provided a critical $10,000 donation to help Palmer's struggling mission keep the lights on. But more importantly, it wasn't just a passive cash transaction. It was massive sweat equity. They launched an initiative called Operation Love.
Oh, Operation Love is so important to this story.
Tell us about it.
It was sponsored by the church's small, intimate home groups, which they called kinship groups. They took volunteers, everyday people who had real construction, plumbing, and trade skills. And they would spend their weekends going deep into the poorest, most neglected neighborhoods in the county.
Okay.
But they weren't just showing up to hand out bagged lunches or old coats. They were physically renovating, rebuilding, and beautifying the rundown homes of deeply impoverished families.
And this right here is the absolute pivot point for the entire deep dive. This is the moment the philosophical seed for the Village of Hope is planted.
Yes, exactly.
They realized that sending a team of carpenters and painters to fix a collapsing porch, repair a leaking roof, and plant vibrant flower beds wasn't just about structural integrity or raising property values. It was about bearing a physical, undeniable message of respect and dignity to people who felt forgotten.
It proved, on a micro scale, that beauty can play a deeply significant part in changing the trajectory of the poor. When a family walks out of their house and sees that a team of strangers cared enough to meticulously restore their home, it fundamentally shifts that family's self-perception.
I look at this mechanism like the broken windows theory, but operating entirely in reverse.
Ooh, I like that. Expand on that.
So in criminology, the broken windows theory suggests that visible signs of disorder and neglect, like a single broken window left unfixed in a building, actively encourage further crime, vandalism, and antisocial behavior because it signals to the community that nobody cares and there are no consequences. It creates a spiral of degradation.
Right, right.
But Operation Love was proving a reverse broken windows theory. A repaid, beautified window, a freshly painted porch, and a manicured lawn actively encourages self-worth, community pride, and a deep psychological desire to maintain that new standard of living.
It provides the vital psychological scaffolding for hope. And Jim Palmer looked at the success of Operation Love and realized that to scale this vision, to create expansive, beautiful, holistic recovery programs rather than just warehousing people in 9 beds, OCRM required massive physical space. They needed an entirely new campus.
And the perfect space, miraculously, was about to open up right in the exact location where Texamite Lewis Whitehead had started his journey gathering mess hall scraps 30 years prior.
Full circle.
But acquiring that massive tract of land meant navigating an absolute minefield of federal bureaucracy, red tape, and a profound constitutional tension regarding the separation of church and state.
Right. So the timeline moves into the 1990s, during the Clinton administration. The federal government is going through a massive restructuring, identifying various sprawling military bases across the country for closure to save defense spending. The Tustin Marine Corps Air Station, a massive footprint of land right in the heart of Orange County, is officially put on the decommissioning list.
And Jim Palmer looks at this massive dormant property with its existing infrastructure and thinks, this is it. This is where we build the dream. We can build a true village of hope. But he's incredibly nervous about stepping into the federal arena to apply for a portion of the land.
And his hesitation was entirely justified. Acquiring decommissioned federal land isn't just about filling out a real estate application and showing you have the funds. It involves incredibly complex, highly scrutinized interactions between religious institutions and the federal government.
It's a legal minefield.
The book highlights a fascinating ideological collision here regarding the separation of church and state. And again, as we present this, we're just conveying the historical events and arguments as laid out in the text without taking a side.
Absolutely.
On one side, you had federal agencies enforcing a strict interpretation of secularization. On the other side, you had advocates arguing that faith-based groups lose their effectiveness if forced to secularize. This legal tightrope almost killed the Village of Hope before it even broke ground.
So Palmer, despite his reservations, puts together a meticulously planned, highly detailed application to acquire a portion of the base for the homeless mission. The bureaucratic process grinds forward, but eventually they hit a massive, seemingly insurmountable obstacle with the United States Navy.
Yes, the Navy was the branch officially overseeing the land transfer process, and their legal department attached a very specific, strict condition to the deed. They required a restriction on the mission's religious hiring practices.
Okay, so they were applying a hardline interpretation of the no aid to religion concept.
Exactly. The Navy demanded that if OCRM took possession of the government land, they could not use faith convictions or religious alignment as a criterion for hiring their staff. They had to hire secularly.
I hear that, but again, I have to step into the shoes of the average taxpayer here. From a purely secular civic perspective, the Navy's restriction makes perfect sense. Is it not inherently dangerous, or at least problematic, for public government land owned by the taxpayers of all faiths and no faith to be handed over to a private group that operates with explicit, exclusionary religious hiring requirements?
It's a huge debate.
Right. I hear the argument about effectiveness, but doesn't exclusionary hiring inherently alienate a homeless person who doesn't share that specific faith? How does the government balance supporting community service without implicitly endorsing or subsidizing a specific religion's hiring discrimination?
It is arguably one of the most fiercely debated questions in American constitutional jurisprudence. The source material addresses this friction through the expert lens of Stanley Carlson Thies, who worked deeply on these policies in the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives during the George W. Bush administration.
Okay. What's his take?
The defense he articulates rests entirely on the concepts of operational effectiveness and organizational identity.
Walk us through the mechanics of that logic. How does hiring impact effectiveness in a soup kitchen?
The argument begins with the premise that the government's ultimate goal in these partnerships is to solve the devastating social crisis homelessness by partnering with the most effective, boots-on-the-ground community groups available.
Right, whoever gets results.
Exactly. The reality is that many of the most successful groups doing this grueling work are motivated, shaped, and sustained entirely by their specific faith. If the government imposes a straitjacket of secular rules upon a faith-based group as a mandatory condition of partnership, they effectively strip away the very core identity and motivation that makes the group successful in the first place.
Oh, I see. By forcing them to adopt government hiring standards, you essentially force the group to become just a smaller, less funded, less efficient version of a standard government welfare agency. You lose the secret sauce.
Exactly. Carlson Thies argues that if the government respects the secular integrity of secular organizations, allowing them to hire based on their secular values, it must logically respect the faith integrity of faith-based organizations. For the Village of Hope to remain a distinctly faith-shaped ministry, they argued they fundamentally needed the freedom to select staff who deeply shared those convictions.
The text mentions a concept that I found really beautiful regarding this. They argue they need staff who can preach the gospel with words when appropriate, but more importantly, they need staff who preach St. Francis style.
Meaning preaching without words.
Yes. Preaching through their daily actions, their endless patience, their tone of voice, and how they physically treat the traumatized residents. Palmer's argument is that you simply cannot guarantee that deeply integrated spiritual environment of care if you are legally barred from hiring your team based on shared mission values.
And this standoff over the deed restriction threatened to derail the entire project. To resolve it, a man named Don Willett, who was serving in the faith-based office at the time and who later became a prominent justice on the Texas Supreme Court, intervened in the process.
What did he do?
He carefully reviewed the Navy's restriction and noted a critical, glaring legal flaw. There was actually no existing federal statutory law backing up the Navy's demand to restrict the mission's hiring practices on this specific type of public benefit land transfer.
Wait, really? So it wasn't a law passed by Congress, it was just an inherited bureaucratic reflex. The Navy lawyers were just copying and pasting standard clauses out of an abundance of caution.
Precisely. It was just bureaucratic inertia. Willett's office pushed back and ordered the Navy to officially strike the requirement from the deed. The land transfer was finally approved, clearing the massive legal runway for the Village of Hope to be built.
That's incredible.
The text also notes how these types of grueling case-by-case battles paved the way for broader systemic legal protections, most notably RLUIPA, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act.
Let's do a quick explainer on RLUIPA, because it sounds like dry legal jargon, but it's actually fascinating. Basically, Congress realized that local city councils and zoning boards were frequently using bureaucratic red tape, zoning technicalities, and endless permit delays as a weapon to covertly zone unwanted religious groups, particularly those serving the poor or minorities, out of their towns. RLUIPA was passed to be a federal shield against that kind of cynical bureaucratic warfare. It forced cities to prove they had a compelling, critical reason to deny these groups land use, rather than just vague blight complaints.
It leveled the playing field, ensuring that faith-based initiatives could overcome these manufactured zoning and property hurdles without being forced to compromise their religious identity. And with those bureaucratic chains finally removed, the land officially secured, and the Amundsons providing massive philanthropic backing, Jim Palmer and OCRM were finally able to fully actualize this grand, radical philosophy of beauty and dignity.
Which brings us to the Village of Hope as it stands and operates today, and the empirical results are absolutely staggering.
They really are.
We need to spend real time exploring the human experience inside the Village of Hope today, because this is where the philosophy meets reality. Let's look at the culmination of these decades of fighting. Today, the Village of Hope isn't just a shelter. It is a highly structured, aesthetically uplifting residential campus that houses over 190 men, women, and children at any given time.
And we must emphasize, it is not a warehouse. It is not a place where people just sit on cots waiting for the day to end. It is an ecosystem of intense, holistic rehabilitation.
The corporate partnerships they've built to facilitate this are incredible. When they decided to build a kitchen to feed the residents, they didn't just buy some industrial vats and call it a soup kitchen. They partnered directly with the Cheesecake Factory to design their training, kitchen, and dining facility.
Wow.
Let's break down the psychology of that. Imagine being a resident. For years, you've eaten out of dumpsters, or you've stood in line for 2 hours to have some lukewarm gruel slopped onto a plastic tray in a depressing room.
Yeah.
Now, you walk into a state-of-the-art, gleaming stainless steel culinary environment designed by a massive, high-standards corporate restaurant brand. You are handed a crisp chef's coat. You are taught culinary skills, food safety, and kitchen management. You aren't being treated like a mouth to feed. You are being treated like a future executive chef. You are being treated like a professional.
The dignity of wearing that chef's coat, of learning a highly marketable skill in an environment of excellence, completely rewires a person's self-esteem. And that immense level of investment yields verifiable, measurable outcomes.
Whose does?
When Jim Palmer is asked about recidivism rates, meaning how many people relapse and end up back on the streets, he points out a telling fact. The government mostly tracks recidivism for the prison system, but OCRM meticulously tracks their own graduates long after they leave the campus.
And the number they report is jaw-dropping. What is it?
They report an 85% success rate, meaning 2 full years after graduating from the intense Village of Hope program, 85% of their students are still sober, securely housed, and financially self-sufficient.
85%. That is an unbelievable return on investment. If you had a CEO in the corporate business world who achieved an 85% success rate on turning around completely distressed, bankrupt assets, they would be on the cover of every financial magazine in the world.
Absolutely.
But we are talking about the most complex entities on Earth. Traumatize human lives.
The source text, drawing again on Marvin Olasky's analysis, draws a very sharp, deliberate contrast between this holistic approach and standard government welfare systems. Olasky argues that beginning in the 1960s, the predominant government approach to poverty emphasized financial entitlements that, in his critical view, quote, merely enabled the poor to stay poor.
Basically a maintenance strategy.
Exactly. You keep them alive, but you don't demand or facilitate transformation. OCRM, by contrast, represents a total restoration strategy.
It is the ultimate lived expression of the cliche, a hand up versus a handout. If you just give someone a handout, a sandwich, and a tent to survive Tuesday, they will inevitably be back on Wednesday needing another sandwich and another tent. The underlying condition remains entirely untouched.
Right.
But if you provide a profound hand up by treating them as complex, holistic human beings who desperately require aesthetic beauty, professional job training, deep spiritual counseling, and psychological therapy, you actually solve the root problem.
And the scope of Palmer's vision has expanded exponentially beyond just the walls of the Village of Hope. The text outlines an entire, far-reaching ecosystem of care. They operate a specialized shelter strictly for mothers and children called the House of Hope, recognizing the unique vulnerabilities of that demographic.
Right.
They run a comprehensive family medical clinic on-site. They provide pro bono legal advisors to help residents clear old warrants and untangle the wreckage of their pasts.
They even have an initiative called the Double R Ranch. They utilize equestrian therapy, specifically integrating a program called Wild at Heart, designed to help broken, hardened men, as the text says, get their heart back.
Equestrian therapy.
Yeah. And let's think about how equestrian therapy actually works. A horse is a prey animal. It survives by being hypersensitive to the emotional state and physical tension of the creatures around it. A horse mirrors human emotion.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so if a man has spent the last 10 years surviving on the streets by being emotionally walled off, aggressively defensive, physically hardened, the horse will sense that tension and refuse to connect or cooperate. In order to handle the horse, that man is forced to physically lower his heart rate. He's forced to relearn gentleness, emotional vulnerability, and trust.
That is profound.
He has to practice the exact psychological tools he needs to successfully reintegrate into his own family and society. It's brilliant.
It's a really dynamic, highly entrepreneurial approach to charity. They're constantly innovating. They also operate mobile medical units, essentially clinics on wheels, that drive out to distant communities like Temecula, providing free, urgent medical care right in the parking lots where families are secretly living out of their cars.
Meeting people where they are.
Exactly. Their operational philosophy explicitly states they refuse to stagnate. They expect to constantly grow, expand geographically, and challenge themselves with fresh, audacious visions.
Okay, let's pull the camera all the way back and bring all these intricate threads together. This has been a massive, sweeping historical journey.
It truly has. We started in 1963 with a single Marine, Tex Scaridate Lewis Whitehead, overcoming his own moral friction to act on an impulse, breaking up a fight under a bridge, and handing out leftover scraps from a military mess hall.
Yeah.
We followed the growth of that tiny spark through bitter existential fights with city councils over property rights and the legal definition of blight. We navigated tense, complex legal showdowns with the federal bureaucracy over religious freedom, hiring practices, and land use.
All of that.
And we saw it all culminate on that very same military base, totally transformed into a multi-million-dollar masterclass in using fine art, intentional beauty, and faith to restore human dignity.
It makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about poverty and recovery. And I want to connect this directly to you, the listener, right now. Think about your own life, your own career, your own sphere of influence. How often do we strip the beauty and the dignity out of our own problem solving?
That's a great question.
Whether you are a manager trying to motivate and improve a struggling team at work, a parent trying to raise a resilient family, or just someone trying to help a close friend who is going through a terrible personal crisis, do we only focus on the bare utilitarian minimum? Do we just try to fix the immediate mechanical problem in front of us? Or do we take the extra time, the extra resources to provide an environment, a tone, and a level of deep respect that actually inspires them to believe they are capable of being better?
The profound, enduring lesson of the Village of Hope is that the environment you purposefully create for someone directly dictates the ceiling of their recovery and their potential. If you give a struggling person the absolute bare minimum, you will almost certainly get the absolute bare minimum back.
Exactly.
But if you surround them with intentional excellence, with beauty, and with respect, they will invariably rise to meet it.
Which leaves us with a final, highly provocative thought for you to mull over long after this deep dive ends. If our physical environments directly dictate our capacity for hope, self-worth, and behavioral recovery, as the Village of Hope so clearly proves with its incredible 85% success rate, what does the design of our everyday public spaces say about us as a society?
It's a bit unsettling to think about.
Right. Look at the sterile, cinder block, almost prison-like architecture of so many of our public high schools. Look at the depressing, windowless, fluorescent-lit waiting rooms of our county hospitals and DMVs. Look at the gray, monotonous cubicle farms in our own corporate workspaces.
Yeah.
If Roberta Amundsen is right, and we truly become what we worship, and if beauty is the necessary spark for human dignity, what exactly are we subconsciously telling the people inside those buildings about what we expect from them?
It's a question that challenges the very structural foundation of how we build and organize our society.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We'll catch you next time.